started. Appreciate everybody for joining us today. And what we're going to be talking about is planning around incapacity. And so, incapacity is one of those words that when we hear it, it sounds a little harsh and we don't really know exactly what it means sometimes. But it's something that's a big risk for all of us, because nowadays people are just living longer, right? And they say that the average person at some point in their life is going to need long-term care, because we're living long enough nowadays that we have a long time to be able to consider whether we're have dementia, or whether we have Alzheimer's, or whether we just get to the point where we can't get around as easily. And so that's a significant risk, in addition to having an accident or something that could happen during our life and cause us to have assistance to be able to recover. And so the statistics say that the majority of Americans are actually going to need long-term care at some point in their life. So the plan around incapacity is really something that most of us probably will benefit more from during our lifetime than even what happens after we die. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how we plan around it. But really, there's two sides to the question. If we got to the point where we needed to make decisions in regards to our long-term care, there's the financial aspect of how we're going to pay for care, and then there's the legal aspect of who's going to be empowered to make decisions on our behalf, and who can actually step in and assist in those moments, right? So I want to share two short stories with you guys before we jump into things. And the first one is, we have a client of ours who he was in his early 40s, and he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And he had done his estate planning as a young man, and which was smart, but he had put his mom as his power of attorney and as his trustee, and then his backup was his sister. And since that time, he had gotten married, he had a child, and then in his early 40s, he gets diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And it was pretty devastating for the family. But the wife is trying to figure out the finances and what's going on and how to take care of him. And Alzheimer's is one of these diseases that just becomes very heartbreaking very quickly, right? And so he would start wandering, and then he would wander to the school to try to pick up his daughter from school. But school wasn't out yet, and he'd get in trouble, and then they'd call the police, and she had to come and intervene, and she wouldn't be able to keep her job because she had to keep track of him and take care of him. And then there's very rapid decline sometimes cognitively. And one of the things that happens at times, not always, but with his situation, was that he would become violent when he didn't get his way. And of course, he was a much bigger person, so it was difficult for them to be able to make sure that he was being taken care of properly, and that he wouldn't do things that could potentially hurt himself or hurt the family. And then every time that something was needed, and the police showed up, or the medical facility had questions or whatever, the wife wasn't empowered to make those decisions, because the mother was the one that had the power of attorney. And so she was the one that had to make all the decisions. And unfortunately, they didn't get along, right? And so it just became a nightmare for the family. That's what happens when you don't have a proper plan in place, or when your plan is not up to date, right? And so there's a lot of situations where we imagine that these things are not going to happen to us, because we just think that it's automatic that things will be okay, right? Well, of course, if something happens to my spouse, I can make decisions for them. Or of course, if my spouse has a bank account and I need to access it, I could go to the bank and access it. That's not how the laws work here in the United States, right? You have to specifically be empowered to be able to access accounts, or to be able to make specific decisions. And if you don't have something in writing allowing you to make those decisions, or allowing you to do those things, then the only way to be able to get that authority is through the court system. And so oftentimes it leads to what's called a guardianship or conservatorship. And a guardianship or a conservatorship, a guardianship is basically for your person, your living situation, conditions, and your health and welfare, and all those sort of things. And we think of guardians when we think of children a lot of times, young children, and it's important to have a guardian for them, especially if the parents aren't around. But it's also important when you get to the point where you're unable to make those decisions on your own behalf. And so whether it's because of an accident, or whether it's because of declining mental health, or whatever the reason may be, it's important to empower somebody that you trust to make those decisions. Because if not, the interested parties would present themselves to the court, and the court would grant that authority to somebody. And the process of a guardianship takes away your rights to make your own decisions, and it gives it to somebody else, right? And so that's sometimes necessary, but with simple documents in place, often it's unnecessary, right? The same thing with the conservatorship. The difference with the guardianship or a conservatorship over the person, and a conservatorship over the estate, or what we call a general conservatorship, is that the conservatorship has to do with your financial affairs, your financial decisions, your assets, and those sort of things, rather than your person, right? And so the idea is that if you have some basic documents, you can avoid the need to have to go to the court system altogether. And again, sometimes we think this is automatic, but it's not. I share this story a lot. My sister, when she was in college, she was young, she wasn't married, she didn't have any kids, she didn't really own any property. We had never thought about helping her to do an estate plan because of how early she was in her adult life, right? And she found herself unconscious in the hospital. And the hospital called my parents, and they asked them if they had a medical power of attorney or a healthcare directive of any kind. And of course they didn't. And so the hospital said, well, we can't tell you anything, but your daughter's here. That happens because there's a law called HIPAA. The HIPAA law, right? And pretty much every state has, on a state level, some form of the HIPAA law, and on a federal level, it applies as well, but prevents the medical facility from sharing your private medical information, your private healthcare information, unless they have something in writing giving them permission, right? And so since my parents didn't, they had to travel for 2.5 hours, get to the hospital. Luckily, my sister was conscious by the time they got there, and she could give permission for them to be involved in making decisions. But as soon as you turn 18, you're an adult. So there's nobody that's empowered automatically to make decisions on your behalf. And especially when there's liability on the line, institutions are not going to allow you to access accounts or to make decisions unless you have something in writing authorizing you to. So the basic documents that are important to have in place to avoid these sort of risks are, number one, again, what we call a medical power of attorney or a medical directive. And number two, a financial power of attorney. And every state has different names for these documents, but basically one of them empowers somebody that you trust to make medical decisions on your behalf, and the other one empowers somebody that you trust to make financial decisions on your behalf. And it's important when you do your powers of attorney to make sure that you're looking for a springing, durable power of attorney. So what does that mean? A springing power of attorney means that it's not active immediately. It becomes active when you become incapacitated. And so if you have a power of attorney that's active all the time, you may have somebody that abuses it, that uses it without permission or without a need to. And so you don't want a power of attorney floating out there all the time just because, unless you really trust the person, maybe they're your spouse or that sort of thing, and it may be necessary. But most of the time, you want your power of attorney to become active only when it's needed. So that's the springing provisions. And then you also want your power of attorney to continue to stay active after you're incapacitated, because some powers of attorney will stop once you become incapacitated, and then, well, what's the point, right? It won't continue functioning. And so you need it to be durable. Durable means that it continues even after you're unable to make decisions for yourself. So not only have you empowered somebody to step into your shoes, make decisions on your behalf, but if there's no point where you could make that call again because you're no longer have capacity, then somebody can continue using those documents, right? And the definition of capacity is one of these definitions that's very fluid, but from the legal perspective, what we're looking for is that you or whoever, whoever your loved one is, that you can recognize who you are, more or less who you are, where you are, what you own in general terms. You don't have to know all the details of exactly how much is in every account, but you have to have a general idea of what your belongings are. And you have to have a sense of who the natural objects of your affection are. And what that means is you need to know who your friends and family are, right? And so if you meet that standard of capacity, then the chances are that you have testamentary capacity. And that means that you could do a will, you could do your powers of attorney, you could do a healthcare directive, and you could empower somebody to then step in when that's needed. And the reason I mention that is because sometimes, especially if you have declining cognitive ability, we have to draw a line at some point where we say, well, this person can no longer make decisions for themselves. Most of the time that comes in the form of a doctor's letter. And often we don't just want one doctor's letter, we want at least the opinion of two independent doctors, right? But once you have that diagnosis, then they can't sign anything anymore, because then you have to go to court to have the permission or to have the authority to make decisions on their behalf. Up until then, if they have the capacity, or if they have testamentary capacity enough to be able to answer those questions, then they would be able to do their documents and empower somebody to then step in and manage things on their behalf. And if you are not familiar with some of the other seminars that we've done about general estate planning, a revocable living trust is often a really good tool as well to plan for your estate and make sure that you empower somebody as a trustee to be able to manage your affairs and your assets without having to go through the court system at all, right? And so these are the basic documents that you would need to have from a legal perspective to be able to make legal decisions and to be able to manage things from the legal decision-making side. But the other side of it is just as important, which is if you get to the point where you need this kind of care, often it can become very expensive. So how do we pay for it? And we need to have a plan for how we're going to approach it, how we're going to be able to afford or to be able to pay for that sort of care, right? And so before we get into that, let me share with everybody, when it comes to long-term care, it's not just because you have a disability, or because you get to the point where you're cognitively impaired, or maybe it's not even to the point where maybe you need help every once in a while and you live semi-independently. There's a specific definition for long-term care, and the way that you qualify for long-term care needs, around the clock care, right, or skilled nursing care, and they have a lot of different names for it, and there's a whole spectrum or kind of a range of potential needs when it comes to long-term care and these sort of cognitive decline situations. But what they're looking for is whether you can perform your activities of daily living. And so the activities of daily living that each one of us every day pretty much deal with, and we have to be responsible for ourselves, and these are very broad definitions, but we'll go through each of them. Number one, personal hygiene, right? So for example, being able to take care of yourself in terms of showering or bathing, personal grooming, that sort of stuff. If you can't do that for yourself and you need somebody to assist, then that would be one of the activities of daily living that you need assistance with. Number two, dressing. When you get ready for the morning or for the day, if you can actually change your clothes by yourself and be able to get ready and so on and so forth, or even making decisions for how you dress, what you should be wearing, and so on and so forth. That's an activity of daily living. That's a basic function that we need on a day-to-day basis. And if you need assistance, then that's another another activity that may be necessary to have assistance with. Now, sometimes when we get to the point where where we're not as independent, we may not be able to prepare our food or to be able to cook for ourselves, but that's not considered an activity of daily living. But once the food is prepared and it's put in front of us, can we eat by ourselves? That is an activity of daily living, right? And so, to be able to feed yourself, and if you need assistance with that, then obviously, that's something that's basic that would need to come up for regular assistance, right? And then what we call continence. Continence is being able to go to the restroom by yourself, right? And so if you are unable to go to the restroom, or you're unable to get in and out of the restroom to be able to do your duty in there, then that's another activity of daily living, right? And the last one is what we call mobility or transferring. But basically what that means is, whether you live in a one bedroom apartment, or even just in one room, or whether you live in a house, can you get in and out of bed? Can you sit down and get up? Can you move around the house? Can you make it to the kitchen, make it to the bathroom, make it to, And so if you need assistance on a regular basis with any two or more of these, then you meet the definition of, needing long-term care. And once you meet that definition of needing long-term care, then, there's a lot of different options of how that care can be provided. It can be provided by family members at home. It can be provided by, skilled nursing care that comes, home health that comes to your home to assist you. It could be provided by an around-the-clock, facility that you're actually living at. So it can come in a lot of different forms. But once you need assistance with at least two or more of these, then that care can add up very quickly. It can be very expensive. And not only can it be expensive, but it's also draining, right? So when you have family members providing this care for you, the statistics are that family members that are caregivers providing around-the-clock care or long-term care for their loved ones, every year that they spend providing care, they're basically losing a year from their life expectancy. So it's a big drain on somebody who's a caregiver, right? And so, as we're thinking about preparing for the future, preparing for this sort of need, and again, the majority of us, over 70% of us, will likely need this kind of care at some point in our life, right? We need to think about, okay, well, would we want our family to provide us with this care? If they are providing us with this care, are they in a financial position to be able to do that without being compensated? If they're spending their time and working with us and helping us with our activities of daily living and long-term care sort of situation, what are they giving up in order to be able to do that? If we don't want our family members to do it, then how would we want it provided? Would we want to stay in our own home? Would we want to be in a facility? Would we want to make sure that we're regularly seeing our family, or that they're visiting us, or what are the instructions that we would want for our future care? Because if we don't have those things written, if we don't have anybody aware of what our desires are, sometimes those things get forgotten about, and then it doesn't turn out exactly how we want. One of the saddest situations that we had was, and it's not a sad situation per se, but it was a story that always kind of gets to me. One of our attorneys had her grandma, and grandma was in an assisted living facility, and she had declining mental health, and she was forgetting things, and sometimes she wouldn't remember where she was or who she was, and sometimes she wouldn't recognize family members. And one day she goes to visit her grandma, and grandma's very depressed, and she says, "Well, what's the matter, grandma?" And grandma says, "I'm starting to forget things." And she goes, "Well, yeah, we know that, but what's wrong? Why are you sad?" And she says, if I can't communicate, if I can't tell people what I want, are they still going to, are they still going to give me what I want? And she says, well, what do you mean? What do you want? Um, she had a room that was overlooking the mountains, right? She wanted to be able to see out her window and be able to see the mountains. And she said, what if they move me rooms and I can't communicate, right? I can't tell them that I don't want them to move me. What if they stop giving me cake, right? Or favorite dessert after dinner? What if they won't put on my show for me? What if any number of little things that on a day-to-day basis, we don't even think about these things right now because we can take care of it for ourselves. But if you get to the point where you're unable to take care of it for yourself and you're depending on somebody else, what if you got to the point where you couldn't communicate what you want, and those little simple pleasures in life aren't provided to you because your caregivers don't know that that's what you want? That's what she was worried about. And those are things that we can put in writing, that we can provide instructions, or that we can provide guidance on, right? And then when it comes to the financial piece of this, there are three options on how we can decide to pay for this type of care, because this care can be expensive. It can add up very quickly. The average across the country for this level of long-term care is going to be somewhere in the $45,000 to $55,000 range per year per person, right? And that's, by the way, on top of other expenses, because if you're at home and you still have a mortgage, you still have to make your mortgage payments. If you still have bills, you still got to pay the bills, right? If you still have debt that you're paying off, you still got to pay the debt. This is additional costs. And in some states, it's a lot more expensive. If you go to California, or if you go to New York, or if you go to, and depending on the facility as well, is going to also determine the cost. The nicer the facilities, or the more care that is needed, the more expensive that it's going to be. So, on average, it's going to be in the $50,000 range per year, but it may be a lot more than that. It may be significantly more than that. The other thing to consider is that, when you are looking at care, again, the average when somebody needs long-term care is that they would need it for about 2.5 years. That's just, national average of the people who end up needing care. They end up needing it. I think, males are a little bit shorter and females are a little bit longer. On average, about 2.5 years. And so, but none of us know whether we're the average, because we may be the, we may be the exception, right? We have one of our clients who had their loved one, right, with their spouse that was diagnosed with dementia and with Alzheimer's, and he had declining health, and they expected him to be around for a couple years, especially since he had some scares with his heart condition and whatnot. He lived for another 8 years, needing around the clock care. So we don't know if we're going to be the average or if we're going to be outside the norm, right? And so, it's important to think about that as well. But basically, the three options that you have for paying for care are: number one, you can pay for it yourself. Number two, you can have insurance pay for it. Or number three, you can have the government pay for it, right? And for most states, the government program that covers this type of care, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is the Medicaid program. And some states have different names for the Medicaid program because it's administered on a state level. So, in California, it's called Medi-Cal, for example. But basically, the Medicaid program would pay for it, right? So what's the catch with each of these? Well, if you have enough resources, if you have enough money to be able to pay for it yourself, then that's great. And you'll be able to get, probably the best care, because when you self-pay, you have the most options. But again, it can be very expensive. And so it's important to have enough discretionary funds to be able to pay for that care. And because that care can add up very quickly, it can be a huge drain on your estate. In fact, it's one of the biggest drains, the biggest single drains on the legacy that you're building for your estate that you may or may not want to leave behind for your family. So if you get to the point where you need long-term care, it can be extremely expensive and it can be a drain. There are options, and if you meet with a financial professional that can walk you through these options, there are options to earmark funds so that those funds will pay for more care. So you can take $100,000, for example, and then that $100,000 could pay for or could be earmarked in a certain type of account that would give you 2 times the value if it's for long-term care. So for example, if you have $100,000 in an account and it has one of these multipliers, it could actually pay for $200,000 worth of care. And that could be a really good option. And we've sat down with clients that, have fairly significant holdings, right? They have businesses, they have real estate, they have savings. And we have this conversation and we say, what's your plan to pay for long-term care? And they say, I have no idea. I never thought about it. And we say, okay, well, you have a lot of money in stocks. You have a lot of money in, real estate. If you got to the point where you needed long-term care, would it be a good idea for all those things to have to be liquidated? And if they're liquidated unexpectedly, a lot of times you take losses, right? So it doesn't make sense to do that because, it can put you in a difficult situation. You have to sell at a fire sale, right? And so we said, well, wouldn't it make sense to earmark a portion of your holdings specifically to address the need for long-term care? And then we can stretch that money to pay for more care. And that's, where the family goes to be able to pay for that sort of need if you get to that point. That makes sense, right? The second option is you can have insurance pay for it. Now, in the past, the only insurance options to pay for long-term care was what they call long-term care insurance. Long-term care insurance basically lets you prepay for the cost of care. So you're paying, let's say $100 a month in premiums, and then that's building up a pool of money for you for the future, right? So as you pay your premiums, it's giving you, there's 3 measures of what kind of coverage you would have with long-term care coverage. First, there's an exclusion period. That exclusion period basically means that if you need care, they're going to wait for a certain period of time, a certain amount of time before paying for your care. They want to make sure that you need it long-term, right? And so they're going to wait for a certain period of time. Now, you can set it up so that they only wait for 30 days, or you can set it up so that they wait for 90 days, or you can set it up for them to have to wait for 6 months. It's up to you. But the longer that you wait, the longer, the less of a chance that they're going to start paying for care because you have to wait for that exclusion period before the benefits kick in. 90 days is the most common. The reason is because if you have Medicare, which is, the form of health insurance that you get, especially for seniors, that you get to be able to pay for your medical needs, your Medicare will pay for long-term care up to 90 days in your lifetime. So if you need long-term care, your Medicare will cover 90 days, and then it phases out and it stops covering. So Medicare is not the program that pays for long-term care, but it will pay for the initial care that you need when you're transitioning into long-term care, right? And then after those 90 days, then it won't continue paying. You have to figure out another way to pay. So if you have a 90-day exclusion period, that matches up with your Medicare. The second consideration is how much is it going to pay per month? So when you set up your long-term care insurance, it pays a certain amount of benefit every month that you need it for. Maybe $4,000 per month, maybe $6,000 per month, whatever you set it up for. And then the third measure is how long it will be paying for. So again, we talked about the average being about 2.5 years that you need care. If you set it up for it to pay for 2.5 years, at the end of those 2.5 years, if you still need care, well, the insurance is run out. So it's not going to pay for anymore, right? And so those are the 3 measures of long-term care coverage. And you can also get riders that will protect for inflation and increase the amounts and so on and so forth. But those are the 3 measures, basically. In the past, when you get long-term care insurance, that long-term care insurance, if you never use it, you lose it, right? And so you're paying into it, but if you never need it, then, and it's, by the way, it's a personal benefit. So if you yourself have it on you and you never use it, then it's lost. Nowadays, there's more flexible options. So instead of just having long-term care insurance, you can also have life insurance with long-term care riders, or life insurance that have long-term care benefits that will actually double as a life insurance policy, pay out when you pass away, and your death benefit can be used to pay for long-term care. So that's a great option. There are also options nowadays to be able to set aside a lump sum of money into a long-term care type of policy. And then that will give you a pool of money that will pay out for long-term care purposes. So for example, if you were to put in, $100,000, and then you have 4 times that amount in insurance coverage, and it's going to pay out at, $4,000 a month for 4 years, or however you decide to design it, those are good options. The key for being able to have insurance is, number one, you have to get it in place before you have the need for the long-term care. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to get underwritten for that sort of policy after you've already started experiencing those symptoms and you need assistance with your activities of daily living. Number two, the younger you are when you put it in place, the better, right? Because it's going to be less expensive if there's less risk for needing it right away. So insurance is all about the transfer of risk. And so you're going to be paying a lot more the closer you get to the need, right? So those are some of the things to consider. And, if you get to it soon enough, insurance is a great option. Or if you have enough resources to be able to pay for the insurance, it's a great option. But if you fall under a certain threshold where maybe you don't have enough to be able to really pay for the insurance premiums, or you haven't thought about it, or it's too late, right? And you don't have enough to be able to pay for care yourself, but you know that you're going to need it, right? Then the government program of Medicaid can cover your care for long-term care. And the catch is that the Medicaid department, or the guidelines that they have, essentially require that you have little to no assets to be able to qualify. When I say little to no assets, the guideline that we usually use is $2,000 of value. If you have more than $2,000 of value, then you're going to be, you're not going to qualify to be able to get onto the Medicaid program. And every state is a little bit different. They have different guidelines and different rules, and they apply the rules a little bit differently. But as a general rule, that's the benchmark. So there are some assets that are not included in that $2,000 of value. For example, Medicaid department will not force you to sell your personal residence in order to qualify for Medicaid. So you can keep your personal residence, right? They may collect against it after you die. If it's not protected, they may collect against it to recover what they spent on during your lifetime for you, but they're not going to force you to sell it in order to qualify. There are other assets that are exempt from being counted for Medicaid. So for example, if you own one vehicle, then that's exempt from being counted for Medicaid purposes. If you own a life estate in a home, then that's exempted. All your personal property, so your TVs, your computers, your iPad, all those things, that's exempted as well from being counted. And you can also, depending on the situation, you can also have family members that have been providing long-term care. If they have a qualifying caregiver agreement, caregiver contract, then there may be benefits for them to be able to apply for or to be able to receive. But that's also an acceptable spend down method of your assets, because if you spend your assets, or if you gift your assets improperly, Medicaid department can look back 5 years and disqualify you from your benefits. And so it's important to make sure that you address this type of planning properly. And if we get to you, far enough ahead of time, before those 5 years, we can put in place a Medicaid compliant trust, or a Medicaid trust, to be able to separate your assets from your estate so that you can still qualify for Medicaid after 5 years. We also have options to be able to help you to properly spend down the assets to qualify for Medicaid immediately or close to immediately without being disqualified. and maintain as much of the value as possible for the family. The planning can get complicated. And so sometimes, people think, well, I only have $100,000. Why would I spend a lot of money on, my estate planning? But if they're planning around Medicaid and we can save that $100,000 for the family, it may be worth paying a couple $1,000s for the planning, right? Because otherwise you have to spend it all and then it goes away in order to qualify for this type of care. And again, the care, if you pay out of pocket, can be expensive. So these are the options that we kind of go through when we do incapacity planning, when we look at planning for long-term care. And whether you're in a situation where that's something that's coming up soon, or whether it's something that's very far out in the future, it is something that you should be considering as part of your overall planning.